Welcome back to Zarila HOA Stories. Drop your country or city name in comments. Chapter 1: The Discovery. Karen moved into her cozy suburban home with dreams of a perfect life in a tightly knit community. The kind of place where everyone followed the rules, the lawns were always freshly mowed, and neighbors exchanged friendly smiles over backyard fences. Little did she know, her perfect neighborhood was far from idyllic. The Homeowners Association, HOA, a governing body she reluctantly joined, had a different kind of power over the residents than she had ever expected. The first few weeks in the neighborhood were calm. Karen attended HOA meetings reluctantly, listening as the board members discussed rules about lawn heights, mailbox standards, and even the color of the fences. It all seemed harmless at first. But as the weeks went by, something started to rub her the wrong way. She noticed the HOA levying fines for the smallest infractions. A mailbox that was a shade too dark, a lawn that wasn't trimmed to perfection, a tree that wasn't pruned at the right angle. Some fines were as small as $25, others went into the hundreds. But what bothered Karen the most wasn't the fines themselves, it was the pattern. Karen wasn't the only one who was feeling the weight of the HOA's iron fist. Her neighbors started to voice their frustrations. Some of them, particularly those who had lived there for years, had dealt with the constant fines and threats of legal action from the HOA. But it wasn't just the fines that raised Karen's suspicions, it was the way the HOA seemed to favor certain residents and penalize others without any rhyme or reason. She had heard whispers of favoritism, but as an outsider, she didn't pay it much mind. That was until one night, when she stumbled upon something that would change everything. It all started with a routine visit to the HOA office. Karen had received another fine for what the HOA claimed was an overgrown shrub in her front yard, which she thought was absurd. She went down to the local HOA office to contest the charge. She was greeted by a young woman at the desk who looked bored but polite enough. After explaining her case, Karen sat down to wait as the woman disappeared into the back room to retrieve her file. As Karen waited, her eyes roamed the office, landing on a small filing cabinet tucked in the corner. It was locked, but its contents seemed so secretive. The thought crossed her mind to let it go, but her curiosity got the best of her. She leaned in closer, scanning the labels on the open drawers. It was there, in plain sight, that she saw something that caught her attention. One of the folders was labeled Special Considerations. Karen knew she was pushing it by even considering looking through these files, but her instincts told her that something was off. She glanced around to make sure no one was looking and quietly slid the drawer open. The folder she found contained a list of names, and not just names, but detailed reports on each homeowner. There were financial statuses, property values, and personal information that Karen knew was supposed to be private. What caught her eye most was the section labeled Disciplinary Actions, a record of fines, warnings, and even threats of foreclosure. But what struck her as most strange was how some homeowners seemed to be getting away with murder. There were reports of people not paying their dues for months, some of whom even had violations on record that should have resulted in huge fines or penalties. But there they were, getting off with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Karen's heart raced as she read through the files. Some of the names were familiar, neighbors she had waved to and smiled at over the past few weeks. They had been fined for things she hadn't even noticed. The fines were harsher, and their punishments seemed disproportionate to their offenses. And then it clicked. The HOA was not just being petty or overzealous. They were deliberately targeting certain residents, and favoring others. She couldn't understand why, but Karen knew one thing for sure: this was shady, and it had to be stopped. Before she could read any more, the young woman returned, and Karen quickly closed the drawer, pretending nothing had happened. She left the office with the same fine still hanging over her head, but now her mind was racing. She had discovered something that wasn't just about her, it was about the entire neighborhood. The HOA's dirty little secrets were finally coming to light, and Karen wasn't the type of woman to let that go unnoticed. As she walked back to her car, she knew what she had to do. She had uncovered the truth, but now it was time to expose it. But how? Karen wasn't just going to let the HOA get away with this. She would fight back. She would expose every single one of their dirty secrets and make sure the entire community knew what they were really dealing with. But Karen wasn't naive. She knew this wouldn't be easy. The HOA had a lot of power, and they were clearly willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their interests. But that only fueled her fire. She had nothing to lose and everything to gain. It was time to take action. Karen's journey of revenge had just begun. Chapter 2: The Plan Takes Shape. After Karen left the HOA office, her mind raced with a mix of anger, disbelief, and determination. She couldn't let the HOA continue to manipulate the neighborhood like this. But she knew she had to be smart about it. The last thing she needed was to make an enemy of the HOA without a solid plan in place. Karen wasn't a rookie in the art of strategy. She had dealt with difficult people before, and now, the HOA would feel the full force of her wrath. Her first step was to dig deeper. She couldn't just walk into the HOA office again and demand more files. That would raise too many red flags. No, she needed to get information from other sources, the ones who had been wronged, the ones who could confirm what she had found. Karen decided to begin by talking to her neighbors, the ones she knew had been fined unfairly. She didn't want to make it too obvious, though. She had to tread carefully. If she came across too forceful, she risked alerting the HOA that someone was investigating them. She started with her immediate neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, an older woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. Karen had noticed that Mrs. Thompson's house was always meticulously maintained, but there was a subtle tension around her. Karen decided to bake her some cookies and bring them over. After small talk about the weather and the latest neighborhood gossip, Karen casually steered the conversation toward the HOA. "I've been noticing some fines popping up lately," Karen said, trying to sound as casual as possible. "Do you think they're being a bit too harsh?" Mrs. Thompson's face immediately hardened. She glanced over her shoulder as if checking if anyone was listening before speaking in a hushed tone. "Oh, honey, they've been at it for years. Every time they find something, they fine me. I'm always one step away from getting in trouble for something they make up. A week ago, they fined me for my mailbox being too rusty. Can you believe it?" Karen's heart sank. This was just like what she had read in the files. It wasn't just petty complaints, the HOA was making up charges to harass people. Karen's mind began to race with ideas. She needed more examples, more people willing to speak out. She decided to make it her mission to gather as much information as possible. Over the next few weeks, Karen spoke to other neighbors, some she knew well, others just casual acquaintances. Each conversation was similar: complaints about random fines, unclear regulations, and the eerie feeling that certain neighbors were given special treatment. One neighbor, Mr. Clark, had been issued a fine for a small crack in his driveway that he was in the process of repairing. But another neighbor, Mrs. Green, had a driveway that was much worse, filled with potholes and cracks, yet she had never been fined once. It was all starting to make sense to Karen. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were playing favorites and punishing those they didn't like. Karen realized the power of social proof. She needed more than just her own findings, she needed to rally her neighbors. If enough people came together and shared their stories, the HOA would be exposed for what it truly was: a corrupt organization that didn't care about the community, but only about collecting fines and controlling people. But Karen knew that wasn't enough. The HOA had power, and they wouldn't give up their control easily. She needed to gather evidence, something concrete that would make the HOA's dirty dealings undeniable. She couldn't rely on just stories, she had to find hard proof. The files she had seen in the office were a start, but they weren't enough. Karen had to find more. So, she began her next phase of the plan: surveillance. She didn't want to jump into anything too drastic right away. Karen had learned to play the long game. She began to keep a closer eye on the HOA board members, taking note of their actions and the kinds of people they interacted with. It didn't take long before she noticed some suspicious behavior. One evening, she saw Mr. Henderson, the HOA president, meet with a contractor in the parking lot of the community center. The conversation was hushed, but Karen could see the exchange of money. That raised a red flag. Was the HOA president taking kickbacks from contractors for recommending them for neighborhood projects? If so, this was bigger than just fines, it was a money laundering scheme. Karen's heart pounded as she watched the two men shake hands and exchange a briefcase. She had to get her hands on that footage. The next day, she scoured through the community surveillance footage at the local convenience store and noticed that they had cameras aimed directly at the parking lot. Karen sweet-talked the store owner into giving her access to the footage, making sure she knew exactly where the camera angles were. That evening, she retrieved the footage and, sure enough, there it was, the shady exchange. Karen knew this was just the beginning. She had the footage, but she needed more. The more dirt she gathered, the harder it would be for anyone to deny the HOA's corruption. She started to expand her operation, meeting more neighbors, collecting more stories, and digging deeper into the HOA's financial dealings. With every new piece of evidence, she was getting closer to the final blow. But Karen wasn't done yet. She knew that in order to truly destroy the HOA, she would need a platform, a way to expose them to the entire neighborhood. The HOA had controlled the narrative for far too long, and now it was time for Karen to take control. She began brainstorming her next move, knowing that the time was coming soon. The HOA would pay for their greed and corruption, and Karen would make sure the entire neighborhood knew the truth. Chapter 3: The Gathering Storm. Karen's heart raced as she pored over the evidence she had gathered over the last few weeks. Each new piece of information she unearthed was another nail in the HOA's coffin. She knew she was getting closer, but the stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just about exposing the HOA anymore, it was about taking them down, about giving her neighbors the power back that they'd lost to the board's corruption. She could already imagine the look on the HOA president's face when they realized their dirty secrets were about to be exposed. But Karen knew she needed a strategy, she had to be smart about this. This wasn't a game of quick retaliation. No, this was chess, and she was playing to win. Her first step was to gather more support. While Karen had been gathering evidence, she'd also been slowly building trust with her neighbors. Slowly but surely, they began to open up to her, telling her their frustrations, their experiences with the HOA, and their struggles with unfair fines. Karen reached out to a few of the neighbors she had spoken to earlier and invited them over for a meeting. She needed to form a united front. One by one, her neighbors arrived, Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Clark, and even Mrs. Green, the one whose driveway had never been fined despite being in worse shape than everyone else's. They all sat around Karen's kitchen table, the mood tense but hopeful. "Karen, what exactly are we doing here?" Mrs. Thompson asked cautiously, glancing at the stack of papers and files on the table. "I mean, I know we've all had our issues with the HOA, but I don't know if I'm ready for something big." Karen leaned in, her voice steady but full of conviction. "I know you're all tired of the fines, the harassment, the feeling that we don't have a voice. The HOA is corrupt, and it's time for us to take back control. We've all been wronged, but together, we can do something about it. I've gathered proof, real evidence that will take them down. We don't have to live like this anymore." The others exchanged wary glances, but they were all nodding now. They knew she was right. They had been suffering in silence for too long, too afraid to fight back. But with Karen's determination and the proof she had uncovered, they had hope. "I've got footage of the HOA president, Mr. Henderson, meeting with a contractor under suspicious circumstances," Karen continued, her eyes burning with intensity. "I've got files showing blatant favoritism, fines being levied without cause, and illegal dealings. If we take this to the right people, it'll be impossible for them to keep up their charade. But we have to act fast." "Who are we taking this to?" Mr. Clark asked, looking a bit skeptical but intrigued. Karen smiled. "I'm glad you asked. We're going public. We're going to expose them in front of the entire neighborhood." The room went silent for a moment. Mrs. Green shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Are we sure about this? What if they retaliate? The HOA has the power to make our lives miserable. Karen nodded, understanding her concern. I know the risk, but the only way to fight back is to shine a light on them. If we do this right, we'll have the entire community on our side. They won't be able to get away with this anymore. The meeting ended with a clear plan. Karen would present the evidence she had gathered at the next HOA meeting, and the group would rally the neighborhood. It wasn't just about fighting the HOA anymore, it was about making sure every homeowner knew they weren't alone. They were a community, and together, they could take down the corrupt system that had held them hostage for so long. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Karen worked tirelessly, compiling everything she had into a clear, organized presentation. She knew she needed to make an impact. If she was going to expose the HOA, she had to do it in a way that would leave no room for doubt. She sent out flyers, asking her neighbors to attend the next HOA meeting, telling them that the truth would be revealed. She even started a group chat with the people who had agreed to stand with her, encouraging them to spread the word. When the day of the HOA meeting arrived, Karen felt the weight of the moment on her shoulders. It wasn't just about the evidence anymore, it was about the future of the neighborhood. As she walked into the community center, she noticed a few faces from her group of supporters scattered throughout the room. They were ready. But Karen knew the real challenge was yet to come. The meeting began as it always did, with the usual pleasantries and small talk about neighborhood issues. But Karen could feel the tension building as she stood at the back of the room, waiting for her moment. She watched as Mr. Henderson, the HOA president, stood at the front, smug as always, clearly unaware of what was about to happen. He called the meeting to order, and Karen could feel the eyes of the room on her. It was time. Excuse me, she called out, her voice steady but loud enough to echo through the room. I have something to say. Something that concerns all of us here. The room went silent as Karen stepped forward, holding her binder of evidence. Mr. Henderson's smile faltered, and Karen saw the flash of nervousness in his eyes. He was trying to hide it, but she could tell. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change. Chapter 4: The Moment of Truth. The room fell into a heavy silence as Karen stepped forward, the weight of her binder filled with irrefutable evidence making her hands feel heavy. She could hear the slight tremor in her own heartbeat, but her voice was steady and unwavering as she addressed the crowd. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore, she was speaking for every person in that room who had been wronged by the HOA, every person whose lives had been made harder for no good reason. Hello, everyone, Karen began, her voice clear and assertive. I'm sure you all know who I am by now. But today, I'm not just here as one of your neighbors. I'm here to expose something that affects all of us. We've all seen the fines, the penalties, the arbitrary rules that seem to come out of nowhere. But I've spent the last few weeks looking into things, and what I found is far worse than any of us could have imagined. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, a mix of curiosity and skepticism, but she was prepared. She flipped open her binder and pulled out the first piece of evidence, the footage of Mr. Henderson, the HOA president, shaking hands with a contractor under suspicious circumstances. The room buzzed as the video played across the screen in front of them, capturing the shady exchange between the two men, the briefcase being handed over, and the obvious money exchange. Take a good look, Karen said, pointing at the screen. This is the president of our HOA, Mr. Henderson, engaging in a secretive transaction with a contractor. And I'm willing to bet you all know who gets the best deals when it comes to neighborhood projects. A few gasps spread through the crowd, and Karen noticed some of the board members shift uncomfortably. She could see Mr. Henderson trying to maintain his composure, but she wasn't done yet. She wasn't even close. This isn't just about one bad deal, Karen continued. This is about a pattern of corruption that's been going on behind closed doors. I have files here that show exactly how this board has been targeting certain homeowners and giving preferential treatment to others. Some of you have been unfairly fined for trivial things like your mailbox being the wrong shade of red, or having a bush that's a few inches too high. Meanwhile, others have violated every rule in the book and yet walk away with no consequences. Let me show you. She began passing out copies of the documents she had gathered, files that revealed an extensive history of favoritism and financial mismanagement. The crowd was silent as they read through the pages, the truth sinking in one word at a time. As Karen explained the inconsistencies, her voice rang with the passion of someone who had nothing left to lose. The more she spoke, the more the room seemed to shift. The board members, who had once seemed untouchable, were now visibly nervous, some of them fidgeting in their seats, others exchanging uncomfortable glances. She turned to the next set of documents. These are violation reports. You can see for yourself how certain people get off easy while others are ruthlessly fined for insignificant infractions. Some of the fines go all the way up to $500 for minor issues, while other people get away with glaring violations. Why? Because they're part of the club. They're in the HOA's inner circle, and they're being protected. A murmur of disbelief swept through the room. Karen could see that the mood was changing. The neighbors who had gathered were beginning to understand the depth of the injustice they had been living under. There were whispers of agreement, even some tears from the older residents who had been unfairly targeted over the years. Karen knew she had to keep the momentum going. It gets worse. I've discovered that the HOA has been using the fines to line their pockets, diverting funds meant for neighborhood improvements into their own accounts. They've been running this scam for years, and I'm not the only one who's noticed. The financial discrepancies in the HOA's books are staggering, and I've got copies of those, too. She pulled out the financial records, showing how funds had been misappropriated, with large sums of money disappearing into thin air. The board members exchanged anxious glances as the proof of their wrongdoing became undeniable. Don't believe me? Karen continued. I've got more. I've been in contact with some of the contractors involved, and they've confirmed that certain members of the board have been taking kickbacks for awarding contracts. These aren't just neighborhood projects. These are contracts that could have gone to local businesses who actually care about our community, but instead, they're being funneled to people who have no intention of improving anything except their own pockets. Karen paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. She could see that people were now genuinely angry, their eyes wide with disbelief. This was no longer about petty fines or small disputes. This was about corruption on a scale they couldn't ignore. The HOA had been abusing their power, and now the truth was out. She turned back to the board. You've made our lives miserable with your arbitrary rules, your fines, and your manipulations. But I'm not the only one who knows what you've been doing. The entire neighborhood is waking up, and we're not going to sit back and let you get away with it anymore. It's time for accountability. The room erupted in applause. Neighbors who had once been hesitant were now on their feet, clapping, cheering, and nodding in agreement. They were fed up, just like Karen, and they were ready to fight for what was rightfully theirs. The HOA members were no longer the untouchable authority figures they once were. They were cornered, exposed, and powerless. Mr. Henderson stood up abruptly, his face pale, but Karen could see the defeat in his eyes. He knew there was no coming back from this. The evidence was too overwhelming, the community too united. He tried to speak, but his words were lost in the rising noise of the crowd. He had no control anymore. Karen stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. We're done with this. We're going to take legal action. We're going to demand transparency, and we're going to take back our community. The HOA is no longer in charge, we are. With that, the room erupted in cheers, and Karen felt a rush of victory sweep over her. She had done it. She had exposed the HOA's corruption, and with the support of her neighbors, she had taken back their power. But the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning. Chapter 5: The Fallout. Karen's heart pounded as she stepped down from the front of the room, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. The evidence was clear, the neighbors were on her side, and the HOA board was visibly shaken. But as the applause faded and the tension in the room simmered, Karen knew that this wasn't over. The fight had only just begun. As the meeting came to a close, Karen and her neighbors exchanged excited glances. They had won this round, but there was still much work to do. The HOA was not going to go down quietly. Karen was no stranger to opposition, but what she didn't anticipate was the depth of retaliation that would soon come. Within hours of the meeting, Karen received an anonymous message. It was a thinly veiled threat: "You've made a huge mistake. Think about your next steps carefully." The message was clear, and it rattled Karen to the core. Whoever sent it knew exactly what buttons to push. But Karen wasn't the type to back down. In fact, the message only fueled her resolve. The following day, she called an emergency meeting with her neighbors. It was time to discuss their next steps. They couldn't just sit back and celebrate their small victory. The HOA would fight back, and they needed a plan. As Karen spoke to the group, her mind raced. She needed to take this fight to the next level. "We've got the proof, but now we need to hold them accountable," she said, her voice steady. "We'll take legal action, but we need to be prepared for what comes next. The HOA will fight dirty. They'll try to discredit us, they'll make our lives miserable. We have to be smarter than them." Mrs. Thompson, who had been one of the most vocal supporters of Karen's plan, spoke up. "What's the next step? How do we make sure they don't just sweep this under the rug?" "We go public," Karen replied without hesitation. "We need to spread the word. We'll take this to social media, to the news, everywhere. The more people know, the harder it will be for them to cover this up. And we need to get a lawyer who's willing to take on the HOA. It's time to hit them where it hurts, in the pockets." The neighbors nodded in agreement, a sense of unity and determination growing among them. But even as Karen spoke with confidence, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something bigger was coming. The HOA had been too powerful for too long. They weren't going to let a group of disgruntled homeowners take them down without a fight. As the meeting concluded, Karen felt a strange chill in the air. She didn't know if it was the weight of the task ahead, or the ominous sense of retaliation she could almost taste, but she knew this fight wasn't going to be easy. The next few days were a blur. Karen set up meetings with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, and she began organizing the neighbors to collect even more evidence. The group worked tirelessly, documenting everything from illegal fines to questionable transactions. The more they uncovered, the more they realized just how deep the corruption ran. But the HOA wasn't sitting idly by. As Karen's group gathered strength, the board began taking action. Neighbors who had supported Karen started receiving harassment, strange late-night phone calls, unfounded complaints about their properties, and even visits from contractors who claimed to be sent by the HOA to inspect their homes. It was clear that the HOA was using every tactic in the book to intimidate them. One evening, Karen received a visit from Mrs. Green, the neighbor with the pristine driveway who had never been fined. Mrs. Green looked visibly shaken as she entered Karen's house. "Karen, they came for me today. They told me I needed to pay a huge fine for my property, something about a zoning violation. I've never heard of such a thing before. They're making up charges, Karen. This is how they're going to break us, one by one." Karen's blood ran cold. It was exactly what she had feared. The HOA was targeting people individually, trying to isolate them so they couldn't fight back together. But Karen wasn't going to let that happen. She told Mrs. Green to stay calm and assured her that the group would stand by her. The next day, Karen got another message, this one more sinister than the last. "You've been warned. You don't want to see what happens next." It wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a clear attempt to scare her into backing down. Karen knew it was the HOA, or at least someone working for them. They were no longer just trying to suppress the truth, they were trying to intimidate her and her neighbors into submission. But Karen wasn't going to back down. She was no longer afraid of the HOA. She had too much at stake now, and she had the power of the community behind her. She called another meeting, this time with a lawyer present, to discuss their options. They would file a lawsuit. They would demand an audit of the HOA's finances, and they would not stop until every corrupt member of the board was held accountable. As the group met, Karen felt a renewed sense of determination. The HOA had underestimated her. They had underestimated the power of a community standing together, demanding justice. But she knew that the battle was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. One of the group members spoke up. "Karen, we've all seen what they're capable of. They won't go down quietly. What if they try to turn the entire neighborhood against us? We're already seeing the tactics they're using. What if they win the PR battle?" Karen took a deep breath. "That's why we go public. We show the world what they're doing. We get the media involved. We spread the truth, and we make sure everyone knows. We won't let them control the narrative anymore." The next few days were a blur of activity. Karen's group worked with the lawyer to prepare their case, while simultaneously reaching out to news outlets and spreading the word on social media. The more the HOA tried to silence them, the louder their voices became. Then, the unexpected happened. The HOA began to crack. The pressure from the media, the growing support from the neighborhood, and the mounting evidence began to take its toll. Rumors started to swirl about potential resignations from the board. The HOA was on the defensive, scrambling to maintain their hold over the neighborhood. But Karen wasn't going to stop. Not until every corrupt board member was removed and the HOA was restructured. She had started this fight, and she was going to finish it. Chapter 6: The Final Battle. The final battle was looming, and Karen knew it was now or never. The pressure was mounting on every side. The HOA, despite their best efforts to intimidate, had started to buckle under the weight of the evidence and the community's rising fury. But Karen wasn't naive. She knew that just because the HOA was on the defensive, it didn't mean they would give up easily. They would fight until the bitter end. Karen and her neighbors had spent weeks preparing for this moment. They had gathered their evidence, secured legal counsel, and garnered the support of their entire community. They were no longer just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for the future of their neighborhood. This was the moment that would determine everything. The day of the final showdown arrived. The neighborhood was buzzing with anticipation, and the atmosphere at the community center where the HOA meeting would take place felt like an electric storm just waiting to break. Karen arrived early, as did many of her supporters. They had spread the word, the time had come for the community to rise up and reclaim their power. As Karen entered the room, she could already feel the tension in the air. The HOA board members were seated at the front, their faces tight with anxiety. Mr. Henderson, the HOA president, was staring at his hands, his usual smug demeanor nowhere to be found. The other board members seemed to be avoiding eye contact with the growing crowd of homeowners who had gathered, their whispers and murmurs growing louder by the second. Karen stood at the front, waiting for the meeting to start. She could feel the eyes of the entire room on her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced before, a mix of anticipation and pure defiance. Today, she wasn't just a homeowner looking to protest a fine. Today, she was leading a movement, and she wasn't going to let them take it from her. The meeting began, and the tension was palpable. Mr. Henderson called the room to order, but there was no enthusiasm in his voice. "We're here today to address the issues that have been raised by a few members of the community regarding recent actions taken by the HOA, he said, his voice shaky. "We'll hear from those who wish to speak before we proceed." Karen raised her hand, and the room went silent. She stepped forward confidently, holding the binder of evidence in her hands. The board members stiffened as she approached the front. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," Karen began, her voice steady but loud enough to fill the room. "I'm not here today to argue over petty fines or small neighborhood issues. I'm here to expose a pattern of corruption that has been festering in this community for far too long. The actions of this board have gone unchecked, and the residents of this neighborhood have suffered because of it." She began flipping through the binder, projecting the evidence on the screen behind her. Here's proof that the HOA president has been taking kickbacks from contractors. And here are the financial records showing how the HOA has been funneling funds into personal accounts. This isn't just about fines anymore, this is about abuse of power, and it's time for this community to know the truth. The room was silent as the residents took in the magnitude of the evidence. It was impossible to deny anymore. The HOA board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Karen didn't stop. This isn't just about me, she continued. This is about every person in this room who has been unfairly targeted, fined, and harassed by this organization. This is about every family that has had to live in fear of retaliation for the smallest infraction. We have had enough. Mrs. Thompson, who had been one of Karen's biggest allies, stood up from her seat. Karen's right, she shouted, her voice filled with raw emotion. We've been living under this tyranny for too long, and I'm not afraid anymore. I stand with Karen, and I stand with all of you. We deserve better. The crowd erupted into applause, and Karen could feel the energy shift. The neighbors were with her. They were ready to fight, and they weren't going to back down. Mr. Henderson tried to regain control of the room, his voice shaking as he spoke. This is outrageous, he sputtered. You can't just come in here and accuse us of. But Karen wasn't finished. Oh, but I can, she said firmly. I have the proof. You can deny it all you want, but the truth is out now. The community knows, and it's too late to cover it up. The board members looked around nervously. The support from the community was overwhelming, and it was clear they were losing control. Karen could see the fear in their eyes, and she knew this was the moment they would either crumble or fight back in desperation. I've spoken with lawyers, Karen continued, her voice growing stronger. We're filing a lawsuit. We're going after the HOA's finances, and we're demanding transparency. The legal action starts now. You will answer for your actions, and we will make sure this community is never controlled by people like you again. At that moment, Karen felt a surge of power, a feeling she had never experienced before. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about reclaiming the dignity and respect that had been stolen from the residents of this community. It was about holding corrupt people accountable for their actions, no matter how powerful they thought they were. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Karen stood tall, knowing that this was just the beginning. The HOA might try to fight back, but they were no longer the ones in control. The community had taken its power back, and Karen had led the charge. The board members were on the defensive now, and they knew their time was running out. Mr. Henderson stood up, his face flushed with anger. This isn't over, he spat. You can't do this to us. Karen locked eyes with him, her voice calm but resolute. Oh, but it is. It's over for you. And it's over for this HOA. The battle had been hard, and there was still more to come. But in that moment, Karen knew that she and her neighbors had won. The HOA would never be the same again. As she walked out of the meeting room, surrounded by her supporters, Karen felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The community was finally free from the grip of the corrupt HOA, and she had played a pivotal role in making it happen. There would be more challenges ahead, but they were no longer alone. The power had shifted. And Karen had been the spark that set it all in motion. If you like watching my video, so make sure to subscribe to Zarila HOA Stories. I'll back in next video. Goodbye. Stay blessed.